The first gunshot of the day cracked through the still morning air as Florence Rutledge stared out the window of her family's farmhouse in Panamint, California, wondering if this would be the day she finally gathered enough courage to leave. The year was 1876, and at 23 years old, Florence had already endured more heartbreak than most women twice her age. Her hand unconsciously drifted to her flat stomach, remembering the three little souls who had never drawn breath in this world, each loss etched into her heart like notches on her father's old oak walking stick. "You still mooning about at that window?" Her mother's voice cut through her thoughts, sharp as a butcher's knife. "There's work to be done, Florence. The Lord doesn't reward idle hands." Florence turned from the window, her gaze meeting her mother's disapproving frown. Martha Rutledge was a hard woman made harder by frontier life, her once pretty face now a map of deep lines that seemed to deepen whenever she looked at her daughter. "I was just about to start on the washing, Mother," Florence said, smoothing down her faded blue dress. "See that you do. Your father needs his shirts pressed before sundown." Martha paused, her eyes traveling to where Florence's hand still rested on her stomach. Her lips thinned. "And stop that foolishness. Dwelling on what can't be changed is a sin of pride." When her mother left the room, Florence released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. 3 years married to Thomas Bell, 3 babies lost, and now a widow at 23 after Thomas had taken a fever last winter. Her parents had reluctantly welcomed her back to their home, but their welcome had come with daily reminders of her failings. "A woman's purpose is to bear children," her father had said when she'd returned home, her possessions in a single trunk, her wedding ring the only valuable she owned. "The Lord has found you wanting, Florence." Outside, another shot rang out, followed by the sound of men's laughter. The Rutledge farm sat on the outskirts of Panamint, a mining town that had sprung up in the shadow of the Panamint Mountains when silver was discovered. The town had grown, bringing with it saloons, a general store, and people from all walks of life seeking fortune in the harsh California desert. Florence finished the washing and was hanging sheets to dry in the midday sun when she heard hoofbeats approaching. Shielding her eyes against the glare, she saw a rider coming down the dusty road that led to their farm. The man sat tall in his saddle, his wide-brimmed hat pulled low against the sun. As he drew closer, Florence recognized Virgil Zane, the new cattle rancher who had purchased the old Thompson place last spring. She'd seen him in town occasionally, exchanging polite nods when they crossed paths at the general store. He was a quiet man, though rumors about him weren't. Some said he'd fought in the war between the states, others claimed he'd been a lawman in Texas. Whatever his past, he kept to himself, which made his appearance at the Rutledge farm all the more unusual. "Afternoon, Miss Rutledge," he called, reining his chestnut stallion to a stop at the edge of the yard. He removed his hat, revealing thick dark hair streaked with premature silver at the temples. His face was tanned and weathered from the sun, but his eyes were startlingly blue against his sun-darkened skin. "Mr. Zane," Florence acknowledged with a small nod. "My father isn't home if you're looking for him." "Actually," he said, dismounting with the fluid grace of a man who'd spent most of his life in the saddle, "I was hoping to speak with you." Florence's hand stilled on the damp sheet. "Me," Virgil approached, leading his horse. Up close, she noticed the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, suggesting a man who'd seen his share of both sun and smiling. She judged him to be in his early 30s, though life in the West aged a man quickly. "I understand you used to help Doc Patterson before." He hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "Before my husband died," Florence finished for him. "It wasn't a secret in a town as small as Panamint." Yes, I assisted the doctor when he needed an extra pair of hands. Virgil nodded. One of my ranch hands took a bad fall this morning. Broke his leg, I think. Doc's away in Bishop until tomorrow, and I was hoping you might take a look at him. He's in considerable pain. Florence glanced back at the house. Her parents would be furious if they knew she was speaking to a man alone, let alone considering going to his ranch. But the thought of someone suffering when she might help tugged at her conscience. I'm not a doctor, Mr. Zane. I know that, madam, but James is hurting something fierce, and you're the closest thing to medical help we've got until Doc returns. Florence hesitated only a moment longer before making her decision. Let me fetch my shawl and leave a note for my mother. I'll need to bring some supplies. 10 minutes later, Florence was seated atop Virgil's horse, her arms wrapped tentatively around his waist as they rode toward his ranch. The warmth of his body against hers was unsettling after so many months without human touch. Thomas had never been an affectionate husband, viewing their marriage as more duty than partnership. Their brief intimacy had been mechanical, focused solely on producing heirs. Your ranch is farther than I realized, Florence said, attempting to distract herself from the impropriety of their position. Just beyond that ridge, Virgil replied, his deep voice rumbling through his chest against her hands. I've got about 500 acres, mostly for cattle, though I keep some horses too. When they crested the ridge, Florence caught her breath. The Zane Ranch spread below them, a sprawling property with a large main house, bunkhouse, barn, and corrals nestled in a green valley with mountains rising majestically beyond. It's beautiful, she murmured. Thank you. Took me 15 years of hard work to afford it. At the ranch, Virgil helped her dismount, his hands strong and sure at her waist. They found James, a young ranch hand no more than 20, lying on a cot in the bunkhouse, his face pale with pain and his right leg at an unnatural angle. Florence set to work immediately, her initial shyness forgotten in the face of the young man suffering. She examined the leg carefully, confirming Virgil's suspicion of a break. It needs to be set, she told both men. It's going to hurt, James, but it's necessary if you want to walk properly again. The ranch hand nodded grimly. Whatever you need to do, madam. Florence turned to Virgil. I'll need something for him to bite down on, some whiskey if you have it, and strong hands to hold him still. Virgil gathered the supplies while Florence prepared. When everything was ready, she nodded to Virgil, who positioned himself at James's shoulders. On the count of 3, she said, positioning her hands on the broken leg. 1, 2, 3. With a swift, practiced motion, Florence pulled and manipulated the bone back into alignment. James's scream, muffled by the leather belt between his teeth, tore through the bunkhouse. When it was done, she bound the leg tightly with strips of fabric, creating a splint with pieces of wood Virgil had provided. You did well, she told James, wiping sweat from his brow with a damp cloth. The worst is over now. By the time they finished, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the valley. I need to get home, Florence said, suddenly aware of how late it had grown. My parents will be worried. Virgil nodded, though a frown creased his brow. It's a long ride in the dark. Let me at least give you something to eat before we go. In his kitchen, Florence watched as Virgil moved with surprising competence, preparing a simple meal of beans, bread, and coffee. They ate in companionable silence, the events of the afternoon having forged an unexpected bond between them. You have a gift, Virgil said finally, breaking the silence. The way you handled James's injury, you've got a healer's touch. Florence felt her cheeks warm at the compliment. I've always been interested in medicine. Doc Patterson was kind enough to teach me what he could, though my father disapproved. He said women should focus on homemaking, not doctoring. Virgil's expression darkened. Some men have narrow views on what women ought to be. The ride back to the Rutledge farm seemed faster than the journey out. The night was clear, stars scattered like diamond dust across the black velvet sky. Florence found herself relaxing against Virgil's back, lulled by the rhythm of the horse's gait and the warmth of the man before her. When they arrived, the house was dark except for a single lamp burning in the front window. Virgil helped Florence dismount, his hands lingering perhaps a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you for your help today, Miss Rutledge. James and I are in your debt." "It was nothing," she replied, suddenly shy again. "I was glad to be useful." The front door opened, revealing Florence's father, his tall frame silhouetted against the light from inside. "Florence," he called, his voice sharp with anger, "where in God's name have you been?" Virgil stepped forward. "Mr. Rutledge, sir, the fault is entirely mine. I asked for your daughter's help with an injured ranch hand, and the task took longer than expected." Joseph Rutledge's eyes narrowed as he looked from Virgil to his daughter. "Zane, isn't it, the cattleman?" "Yes, sir." "Virgil Zane. Well, Mr. Zane, in future you do well to remember that my daughter is not a doctor, nor is she available to go gallivanting across the countryside at your beck and call." Florence winced at her father's tone. "Father, Mr. Zane was in need of help inside, Florence. Now." His tone brooked no argument. Florence gave Virgil an apologetic glance before hurrying past her father into the house. Inside, her mother waited, arms crossed over her chest, disappointment etched into every line of her face. "You have any idea what people will say?" Martha hissed. "A respectable widow spending the day alone with an unmarried man. Have you learned nothing from your failures?" "I was helping an injured man, Mother. There was nothing improper about it." "Nothing improper?" Her father's voice boomed as he entered, closing the door firmly behind him. "You were seen riding double with Zane, your arms around him like a common saloon girl. Who saw us?" Florence asked, her voice small. "Edward Miller was returning from town. He had the decency to stop and inform us where our daughter had gone." Florence's heart sank. Edward Miller was the town gossip. By tomorrow, everyone in Panamint would know she'd spent the day at Virgil Zane's ranch. "I did nothing wrong," she said with more conviction than she felt. "A man was injured and I helped him. That's all." Her father's face darkened with anger. "Haven't you brought enough shame on this family? First, you fail in your most basic duty as a wife, losing 3 babies and leaving your husband without an heir. Now you risk your reputation and ours by carrying on with the first man who shows you attention." Each word was a slap, reopening wounds that had never fully healed. Florence felt tears sting her eyes but refused to let them fall. "I did not lose those babies on purpose," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "And I was not carrying on with Mr. Zane. I was using the skills God gave me to help someone in need." "God gave you a womb that can't hold life," her mother said coldly. "Perhaps if you'd focused more on prayer and less on playing doctor, the Lord might have seen fit to bless you with children." Florence recoiled as if physically struck. Without another word, she turned and fled to her small bedroom at the back of the house. Only there, in the darkness, did she allow her tears to fall. The following Sunday, Florence sat stiffly between her parents in the front pew of Panamint's small church. She could feel the stares and whispers of the congregation behind her. Edward Miller's gossip having spread as expected. Reverend Thompson's sermon that day seemed particularly pointed, focusing on the virtues of female modesty and obedience. Florence kept her eyes fixed on her hands, folded neatly in her lap, wishing she could disappear into the hard wooden pew beneath her. As they filed out after the service, she caught sight of Virgil standing at the edge of the churchyard, hat in hand. Their eyes met briefly before her father placed a firm hand on her elbow, steering her toward their wagon. "Mr. Zane seems quite taken with you," her mother observed coldly once they were underway. "Though what he sees in a barren widow is beyond my understanding." "Martha," her father warned. Though there was little real censure in his voice, Florence remained silent, her thoughts drifting to the blue-eyed rancher and the sense of purpose she'd felt while at his ranch. For those few hours, she'd been more than just a failed wife or a disappointment to her parents. She'd been useful, respected for her skills rather than judged for her shortcomings. 2 weeks passed before Florence saw Virgil again. She was at the general store, selecting fabric for new curtains, when the bell above the door jingled and he walked in. The small space seemed to shrink further with his presence, his tall frame and broad shoulders commanding attention without effort. "Miss Rutledge," he said, removing his hat as he approached. "It's good to see you." Florence glanced around nervously, noting Mrs. Peterson and the storekeeper's wife watching with undisguised interest. "Mr. Zane, how is James recovering?" "Very well, thanks to your care. Doc Patterson says you did a fine job setting the bone." A small smile touched Florence's lips. "I'm glad to hear it." Virgil hesitated, then spoke quietly so only she could hear. "I wanted to apologize for any trouble I caused you. It wasn't my intention to create gossip." "You've nothing to apologize for," Florence replied. "People will talk regardless of what we do or don't do. Still, I'd like to make it up to you." He paused, seeming to gather his courage. "I'm having some neighbors over for a barn dance this Saturday. Simple affair, nothing fancy. I'd be honored if you and your parents would attend." Florence blinked in surprise. A proper social invitation, with her parents included, it was above reproach, a gentlemanly gesture that might help quiet the gossip. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Zane. I'll speak to my parents about it." "Virgil," he said. "I'd like it if you called me Virgil." The warmth in his eyes made something flutter in Florence's chest. "Virgil," she repeated softly. Later that evening, Florence approached her parents as they sat by the fire, her father reading his Bible while her mother mended a shirt. "Mr. Zane has invited us to a barn dance at his ranch this Saturday," she said, trying to keep her voice casual. "Several families from the area will be attending." Her father looked up, his eyebrows raised in surprise. "Zane invited all of us, not just you." "Yes, father." He was very specific about that. Her parents exchanged a look that Florence couldn't quite interpret. Finally, her father nodded. "I suppose we should go. It would be impolite to refuse, and it might help quiet some of the talk." Florence felt a surge of excitement that she carefully kept from her face. "Thank you, father. I'll let Mr. Zane know next time I see him in town." Saturday arrived with clear skies and a gentle breeze, perfect weather for a barn dance. Florence spent extra time on her appearance, wearing her best dress, a deep green that brought out the amber flecks in her hazel eyes. She pinned her chestnut hair in a simple but elegant style, allowing a few curls to frame her face. When they arrived at the Zane Ranch, the celebration was already underway. Lanterns hung from the rafters of the spacious barn, casting a warm glow over the proceedings. A small band played lively tunes in one corner, while tables laden with food and drink lined another wall. Virgil spotted them almost immediately, making his way through the crowd with long, purposeful strides. He greeted Florence's parents with respect, shaking her father's hand firmly and bowing politely to her mother. "Mr. and Mrs. Rutledge, I'm honored you could join us. Please help yourselves to refreshments." He turned to Florence, his eyes warming. "Miss Rutledge, you look lovely this evening." Florence felt her cheeks heat at the compliment. "Thank you, Mr. Zane. You have a beautiful home. Would you care to see more of it? I could show you the garden while your parents get settled." Before her parents could object, another couple approached, drawing them into conversation. Seizing the opportunity, Virgil offered Florence his arm, which she accepted after a moment's hesitation. Outside, the evening air was cool and fragrant with the scent of wildflowers. Virgil led her to a small garden at the side of the main house, where roses and lavender grew alongside more practical herbs. "My mother always said a house isn't a home without a garden," Virgil explained, his voice soft in the gathering twilight. "When I built this place, I made sure to include one in her memory." "It's beautiful," Florence said, touched by the sentiment. "You must miss her. Every day." She was a remarkable woman, strong, compassionate. "She taught me that true strength isn't about power or control, but about how much you're willing to give of yourself for others." Florence thought of her own mother, whose strength had calcified into something hard and unyielding. "She sounds wonderful. She would have liked you," Virgil said, his gaze steady on her face. "She would have appreciated your healing hands and your kindness." Florence looked away, suddenly overwhelmed by the intensity in his eyes. "You hardly know me, Virgil. I know enough." He paused, then added softly, "I know you deserve better than the way your family treats you." Her head snapped up. "What do you mean?" Virgil's expression was apologetic but determined. "People talk in small towns, Florence. I've heard how your parents speak about your losses. As if they were somehow your fault." Florence felt exposed, vulnerable in a way that made her want to flee. "We should return to the barn. My parents will be looking for me." Virgil caught her hand gently as she turned to leave. "Wait, please. I've overstepped and I'm sorry for that. But I want you to know something." He took a deep breath. "Your body isn't your worth, Florence. What happened with your babies, it doesn't make you less of a woman or less deserving of happiness." Florence froze, his words striking a chord so deep within her that she felt it resonate through her entire being. No one had ever said such a thing to her before. Thomas had been disappointed, her parents ashamed, and she had carried the weight of their judgment as her own failure. "How can you say that?" she whispered, tears threatening. "You don't understand what it's like." "My sister," Virgil said quietly, "lost 4 babies before she had a child that lived. I watched her blame herself each time, saw how it nearly destroyed her. But it wasn't her fault, just as it wasn't yours." A tear slipped down Florence's cheek. Virgil reached out hesitantly, his thumb brushing it away with infinite gentleness. "I'm sorry," she said, embarrassed by her display of emotion. "This isn't proper conversation for a social gathering." "Proper be damned," Virgil said with sudden fierceness. "Sometimes truth is more important than propriety." The music from the barn changed to a slower tune, the notes drifting through the evening air like a siren's call. "Dance with me," Virgil said, offering his hand. Florence hesitated, glancing toward the barn where her parents were among the other guests. "Here, here, under the stars where no one will judge us." She placed her hand in his and he drew her close, one hand at her waist, the other holding hers. They swayed together in the garden, surrounded by the scent of roses and the silver light of the rising moon. It was scandalous, inappropriate, and the most perfect moment Florence had experienced in years. "I've thought about you every day since you came to help James," Virgil confessed, his voice low. "I know it's too soon, that you've barely had time to know me, but I wanted you to know that." Florence looked up at him, at the sincerity in his blue eyes. "I've thought of you too," she admitted. "But my parents would never approve. They see me as damaged goods, Virgil, a woman who can't fulfill her purpose." "Your purpose is whatever you decide it to be," he said firmly. "Whether that's healing the sick, raising children your own or others, or simply living a life that brings you joy. No one else gets to define that for you." The music ended, and they stood still, reluctant to break the spell that had enveloped them. From the barn came the sound of laughter and conversation, a reminder of the world beyond their private moment. "We should go back," Florence said reluctantly. Virgil nodded, but before they could move, he spoke again. "May I call on you properly? With your parents' permission, of course." Florence's heart leaped at the prospect, even as doubt crept in. "You deserve a whole woman, Virgil, someone who can give you children, a family." His expression grew serious. "What I deserve is someone who sees me for who I am, not what I can provide. What I want is you, Florence, children or no children." The conviction in his voice left her breathless. "Yes," she whispered. "You may call on me." The remainder of the evening passed in a blur. Florence danced with Virgil twice more, this time in the barn under the watchful eyes of her parents and the other guests. His hand at her waist, his eyes on hers, it all felt like a dream from which she feared waking. When it came time to leave, Virgil walked them to their wagon. "Mr. Rutledge," he said formally, "with your permission, I'd like to call on your daughter next Sunday after church." Joseph Rutledge's expression was unreadable in the dim light. "You seem like a decent enough man, Zane. But I should warn you, my daughter has had difficulties in the past. Her first marriage was childless, despite 3 pregnancies." Florence flinched, mortified that her father would speak so bluntly of such private matters. "I'm aware of Miss Rutledge's history," Virgil replied, his tone level but with an undercurrent of steel. "It doesn't change my regard for her in the slightest." After a long pause, Joseph nodded curtly. "Sunday, then, after church." The ride home was silent, tension thick in the night air. Only when they arrived at the farm did her mother speak. "I hope you know what you're doing, Florence. That man is setting himself up for disappointment if he's expecting you to give him a family." "He knows about the babies, Mother," Florence replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "He doesn't care," Martha scoffed. "All men care about having sons. He may say differently now, but time will tell the truth of it. Sunday couldn't come quickly enough." Florence sat through the church service, barely hearing Reverend Thompson's words, her attention focused on the tall figure at the back of the church. Virgil had dressed carefully in a clean shirt and string tie, his usually unruly hair tamed for the occasion. True to his word, he appeared at the Rutledge farm that afternoon, riding a handsome bay gelding and carrying a small bouquet of wildflowers. Florence met him on the porch, accepting the flowers with a shy smile. "These are lovely, thank you." "Not as lovely as you," he replied, his eyes crinkling at the corners. Her parents insisted on chaperoning their visit, her father maintaining a stony presence in his armchair while her mother served tea with pursed lips and thinly veiled disapproval. Despite the uncomfortable atmosphere, Virgil was unfailingly polite, answering her father's questions about his ranch and business prospects with patience. "I understand you fought in the war," Joseph said, eyeing Virgil over the rim of his teacup. "Yes, sir, with the Union cavalry." 4 years that felt like 40. "And before coming to California, where were you then?" Virgil hesitated briefly. "Texas, mostly. I ran cattle on open range for a while, then saved enough to buy land near San Antonio. Sold it last year for a good profit, which is how I was able to purchase my ranch here." "And why Panamint? It's hardly the center of civilization." A small smile touched Virgil's lips. "I've had enough of civilization to last a lifetime, Mr. Rutledge. I prefer the quiet and the space out here. Room to breathe, to build something meaningful." The questioning continued for nearly an hour before Joseph finally nodded, apparently satisfied that Virgil's intentions and background were acceptable. "You may walk with Florence in the garden if you wish. The windows overlook it, so we'll be able to see you." Outside, in the late afternoon sunshine, Florence felt like she could breathe properly for the first time all day. "I'm sorry about that, My father can be protective. He's looking out for you, Virgil replied charitably. I don't fault him for that. They walked slowly along the garden path, careful to remain in full view of the house. Will you tell me about them? Virgil asked quietly. Your babies, I mean, if it's not too painful, Florence's step faltered. No one had ever asked about her lost children before, not like this, not as if they had mattered, had been real. Are you sure you want to know? Virgil's expression was gentle. They were part of you, Florence. Of course I want to know. Taking a deep breath, she began to speak of the children she had carried but never held. The first, a boy she'd felt certain, lost at 5 months after a fall from a stepladder. The second, gone before she'd even had time to feel it move, a slow bleeding that had left her weak for weeks afterward. The third, the most devastating, carried nearly to term before stillness replaced the vigorous kicking she'd grown to love. We named him Samuel, she said, her voice breaking. He was perfect, just sleeping. Thomas wouldn't look at him. He said there was no point in naming what never lived, but I couldn't bear to let him go without a name. Virgil's hand found hers, squeezing gently. Samuel is a fine name, a strong name. Thomas died 3 months later. Influenza took him in less than a week. Florence's laugh held no humor. My mother said it was God's judgment on us both, him for marrying a barren woman, me for failing in my duty as a wife. Anger flashed across Virgil's features. That's cruel nonsense. God doesn't work that way. Doesn't he? Be fruitful and multiply. It's one of his first commands. And judge not, lest ye be judged is another, Virgil countered. Your mother has no right to claim she knows God's mind on this or any matter. They had reached the end of the garden path and turned back toward the house. In the golden light of the setting sun, Virgil looked at her with such tenderness that Florence felt her heart might burst. May I continue calling on you? He asked. I want to know you better, Florence. All of you, your joys and sorrows, your hopes and fears. Yes, she replied without hesitation. I'd like that very much. Over the next several weeks, Virgil became a regular visitor at the Rutledge farm. Each Sunday after church, he would appear, sometimes bearing small gifts, a book of poetry, ribbons for her hair, once a jar of honey from the hives on his ranch. They would walk in the garden or sit on the porch under the watchful eyes of her parents, talking of everything and nothing. Florence learned that Virgil had been married briefly before the war, his young wife dying of typhoid fever while he was away fighting. He had no children, though he spoke fondly of his sister's 3 boys who lived in Oregon with their parents. I write to them every month, he told her. My oldest nephew, Michael, is 12 now. Smart as a whip, according to my sister, wants to be a doctor someday. You must miss them. I do, but they have a good life there. My sister's husband is a decent man, kind to her and the boys. As summer turned to fall, their conversations grew deeper, more intimate. Florence found herself sharing thoughts and feelings she'd never spoken aloud before: her interest in medicine, her dreams of perhaps someday helping Doc Patterson in a more official capacity. You'd make an excellent nurse, Virgil said encouragingly. You have the knowledge and the touch for it. My father would never allow it, Florence sighed. He barely tolerates our walks as it is. What if you didn't need his permission? Virgil asked carefully. What if you had a husband who supported your interests instead of stifling them? Florence's breath caught in her throat. Virgil, I'm not proposing. Not yet, he added quickly. That would be too soon for both of us. But I want you to know that if I do, it would be with the understanding that you are your own person, not just an extension of me. His words warmed her from within, a feeling so foreign and wonderful that she scarcely knew how to respond. I think I might like being married to someone who thinks that way, she said finally, her voice soft with emotion. As October painted the hills with gold and crimson, Virgil invited Florence and her parents to Sunday dinner at his ranch. To her surprise, her father accepted, perhaps finally warming to the idea that the respected rancher's interest in his daughter was genuine. The ranch house looked different in daylight than it had the night of the barn dance. Florence could see the care Virgil had put into making it a home comfortable furniture. Bookshelves lined with volumes of poetry and history. Photographs of his family displayed proudly on the mantel. "This is my sister, Catherine, with her husband and boys," Virgil explained, showing Florence a family portrait. The resemblance between Virgil and his sister was striking, the same blue eyes and strong features, though Catherine's expression held a softness that spoke of a gentler life than her brother's. Dinner was a success. The food excellent thanks to Virgil's housekeeper, Mrs. Donnelly, a widow from town who came daily to cook and clean. The conversation flowed more easily than Florence had anticipated, her father seeming genuinely interested in Virgil's plans for expanding his cattle operation in the spring. After the meal, Virgil suggested a tour of the property. Joseph and Martha declined, preferring to rest in the parlor, but encouraged Florence to go. It was the first time she and Virgil had been truly alone since their dance in the garden. "Your parents seem to be warming to me," Virgil observed as they walked toward the stables. Florence smiled. "I think they're impressed by your success. My father respects a self-made man." "And what about you, Florence? What do you respect in a man?" She considered the question seriously. "Kindness," she said at last. "Honesty, the courage to stand by his convictions even when they are unpopular." "Like supporting a woman's interest in medicine," Virgil suggested with a slight smile. "Perhaps." She returned his smile. "Though I'm equally impressed by a man who can cook his own meals and doesn't think it beneath his dignity to wash a dish." Virgil laughed, a rich, warm sound that made Florence's heart lighten. "Mrs. Donnelly would have my hide if I interfered in her kitchen, but I'll have you know I managed quite well before she came along." At the stable, Virgil introduced her to his horses, the chestnut stallion she'd ridden with him that first day, the bay gelding he'd ridden to her house, and a gentle dappled mare with intelligent eyes. "This is Daisy," he said, stroking the mare's neck. "I thought she might suit you." "If you wanted to learn to ride, that is." Florence blinked in surprise. "For me to ride? On my own? Why not? Every woman in these parts should know how to handle a horse. Independence is a precious thing, Florence." The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. Thomas had never suggested such a thing, viewing horseback riding as unsuitable for ladies except in dire emergency. Her father held similar views. "I'd like that," she said, reaching out to pat Daisy's velvet nose. "Though I'm not sure my father would approve." Virgil's expression grew serious. "Florence, may I ask you something personal?" "Of course." "Are you happy living with your parents? Truly happy?" The question caught her off guard. Was she happy? She had a roof over her head, food on the table, the security of family, but happiness? That had been in short supply until Virgil entered her life. "They're my family," she said, avoiding a direct answer. "They took me in when Thomas died." "That's not what I asked," Florence sighed, turning away from his searching gaze. "No," she admitted finally. "I'm not happy there. Every day I'm reminded of my failures, of how I disappointed Thomas and them. But what choice do I have? I have no money of my own, no prospects beyond." She stopped abruptly, realizing what she'd been about to say. "Beyond marriage," Virgil finished for her. "To me or someone like me." She nodded, ashamed of how mercenary it sounded. "Florence, look at me." Virgil's voice was gentle but firm. When she met his eyes, he continued, "There's no shame in wanting security, in needing the protection marriage can provide." but I want you to marry me because you want to, not because you need to." Her heart thundered in her chest. "Are you asking me now?" "I'm asking if you could love me. Not today, perhaps, but someday. Could you see yourself building a life with me as partners in all things?" Florence thought of the months they'd spent getting to know each other, of his kindness and understanding, of the way he looked at her as if she were whole and valuable just as she was. "I think," she said slowly, "I already do love you, Virgil. I've been afraid to admit it, even to myself, because loving someone means risking loss again. But yes, I could see a life with you. I want that life." The joy that spread across his features was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. He stepped closer, his hands coming to rest lightly on her waist. "May I kiss you, Florence?" she nodded, unable to speak past the emotion clogging her throat. Virgil lowered his head slowly, giving her every chance to change her mind, before his lips met hers in a kiss so tender it brought tears to her eyes. It was nothing like Thomas's perfunctory pecks. This was a promise, a beginning. When they parted, Virgil rested his forehead against hers. "I love you too," he whispered. "Enough to wait until you're ready for whatever comes next." "I don't want to wait," Florence surprised herself by saying. "Life is too uncertain, too precious to waste a moment of it." Virgil smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners in the way she'd come to adore. "In that case, Florence Rutledge, will you do me the great honor of becoming my wife?" "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes, I will." They returned to the house hand in hand to find her parents preparing to leave. The announcement of their engagement was met with mixed reactions, her father's cautious approval, her mother's thinly veiled skepticism. "You're rushing into this," Martha warned on the ride home. "He may say he doesn't want children now, but men change their minds." "What will you do when he realizes you can't give him a son?" "Virgil isn't Thomas, Mother," Florence replied, a new confidence in her voice. "He loves me for who I am, not for what my body can or cannot do." "All men want sons," her mother insisted. "It's in their nature." Florence thought of Virgil's tenderness when she told him about Samuel, of his genuine sorrow for children he'd never known. Perhaps, but some men understand that there are many ways to build a family. The weeks leading up to the wedding were a whirlwind of preparations. Virgil insisted on a proper ceremony in the church, with a reception afterward at his ranch. Florence found herself swept up in decisions about flowers, food, and her wedding dress, which Mrs. Thompson, the Reverend's wife, helped her sew from fine fabric ordered from San Francisco. Not everyone in Panamint approved of the match. Florence overheard whispers at the general store, women wondering what Virgil Zane saw in that barren widow, speculating that he must be desperate for a wife to take on damaged goods. Each comment stung, but Florence found that with Virgil's love as a shield, they hurt less than before. The most difficult conversation came 2 weeks before the wedding, when Florence's mother cornered her in the kitchen. "Have you told him everything?" Martha demanded. "About why you lost those babies?" Florence stiffened. "What do you mean? The doctor and Bishop said there was something wrong with you, something in your womb that couldn't hold a child. Have you told Virgil that?" The memory flooded back the doctor's grave face after the third loss, his clinical explanation of a malformed uterus that made carrying to term nearly impossible. Thomas had been furious, blaming her for not disclosing a condition she hadn't known existed. Her parents had received the news as confirmation of their belief that Florence had somehow failed in her fundamental duty as a woman. "No," Florence admitted. "I haven't told him that specifically." "Then you're deceiving him," Martha said coldly. "He has a right to know the full truth before he binds himself to you." The accusation hit Florence like a physical blow. Was she deceiving Virgil? He knew she'd lost 3 babies, knew there might never be children, but she hadn't shared the doctor's diagnosis. That evening, she asked her father to take her to the Zane ranch, insisting it was urgent. When they arrived, she found Virgil in his study going over accounts. "Florence," he said, rising quickly when he saw her troubled expression. "What's wrong?" "I need to speak with you privately," she said, glancing at her father, who had followed her inside. "Please." Joseph frowned but retreated to the parlor, leaving them alone with the door ajar for propriety's sake. "What is it?" Virgil asked, taking her hands in his. "Has something happened?" Florence took a deep breath. "There's something I should have told you earlier about my condition." Haltingly, she explained what the doctor had told her after her third loss, that the structure of her womb made it unlikely she would ever carry a child to term successfully. "The doctor and Bishop said it wasn't something that could be fixed," she finished, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thomas called me defective. My mother says I'm deceiving you by not telling you this specifically." Virgil's expression had remained unchanged throughout her explanation. Now, he reached up to cup her cheek gently. "Florence, did you think this would change how I feel about you, shouldn't it?" she asked, confusion evident in her voice. "You deserve to know what you're getting, a wife who almost certainly can never give you children." "What I'm getting," Virgil said with a hint of anger, "is the woman I love, a compassionate healer, a strong survivor, a soul that matches my own." He shook his head. "I told you before, your body isn't your worth. I meant it then, and I mean it now. But what about children, a family?" "There are many ways to build a family, Florence. There are children who need homes, love, protection. If we decide we want children, we'll find a way, together." Relief washed over her like a cleansing rain. "You're certain? You won't regret this decision later?" "The only thing I would regret," Virgil said firmly, "is losing you because of other people's narrow definitions of what makes a marriage, a family, or a woman valuable." 2 days before the wedding, a letter arrived for Florence. The handwriting was unfamiliar, the postmark from Oregon. "It's from Virgil's sister," she told her mother, breaking the seal. "Catherine." The letter was warm and welcoming, expressing Catherine's joy that her brother had found someone to love after so many years alone. But it was the final paragraph that brought tears to Florence's eyes. "Virgil tells me you have a gift for healing, a calling I understand well as I've done some nursing myself. He also shared, with your permission I trust, the heartbreak you've endured in losing your little ones. Please know, dear Florence, that in marrying my brother you're joining a family that will value you for exactly who you are. We look forward to meeting you someday soon and embracing you as our sister." On her wedding day, Florence stood before the mirror in her childhood bedroom, hardly recognizing the woman who gazed back at her. The dress was simple but elegant, ivory rather than white in deference to her status as a widow. Her hair was arranged in a crown of braids interwoven with small yellow roses from Virgil's garden. "You look beautiful," her father said from the doorway, his voice gruff with emotion. It was perhaps the first compliment he'd paid her since she was a little girl. "Thank you, Father." Joseph Ruddledge shifted uncomfortably. "I haven't always been kind to you, Florence. Your mother and I, we wanted what was best for you, but perhaps we didn't always show it in the right way." Florence turned to face him, surprised by this unexpected moment of vulnerability. "You did what you thought was right. Zane is a good man," her father continued. "Better than I gave him credit for at first. He loves you, truly loves you, not just what you can provide for him." He paused, then added softly, "I'm sorry we couldn't see your worth the way he does." The admission stunned Florence. Before she could formulate a response, her father offered his arm. "It's time." The church was filled with people from town and neighboring ranches. Florence walked down the aisle on her father's arm, her eyes fixed on Virgil waiting at the altar. He watched her approach with such love and pride that she felt her heart might burst. Reverend Thompson conducted the ceremony with dignified simplicity. When it came time for the vows, Virgil surprised Florence by having prepared his own. "Florence," he said, his voice steady and clear, "I take you as my wife to cherish and protect, to respect and support, to walk beside rather than before or behind. I promise to see you always as the remarkable woman you are, to value your mind and heart above all else, and to build with you a home filled with love, laughter, and mutual understanding. This is my solemn vow." Florence, not to be outdone, responded with words she had carefully composed the night before. "Virgil, I take you as my husband with gratitude and joy. I promise to be your partner in all things, to support your dreams as you have supported mine, to face whatever challenges life brings us with courage and faith. I vow to love you completely and faithfully, to create with you a life of purpose and meaning. This is my heart's promise." When Reverend Thompson pronounced them husband and wife, Virgil's kiss was tender yet filled with promise. As they turned to face the congregation as Mr. and Mrs. Zane, Florence caught sight of her mother in the front pew. For the first time in years, Martha Rutledge's expression held no disappointment, only a grudging acceptance that perhaps her daughter had found happiness after all. The reception at the Zane Ranch, now Florence's home, lasted well into the evening. The barn had been transformed once again for dancing, while tables set up in the yard groaned under the weight of food prepared by Mrs. Donnelly and several women from town. As darkness fell, lanterns were lit, casting a golden glow over the celebration. Florence found herself surrounded by well-wishers, many of the same people who had whispered behind her back now, eager to congratulate her on making such an advantageous match. "Don't mind them," Virgil murmured in her ear as he led her onto the dance floor. "People will always find something to talk about." "I don't mind," Florence replied honestly. "Not anymore." They swayed together to the music, his hand warm and steady at her waist. "Are you happy, Mrs. Zane?" he asked softly. "Completely," she answered, raising her face to his. "And you?" "More than I ever thought possible." He glanced around at the festivities, then back at her with a mischievous smile. "What would you say to slipping away? I believe I'm entitled to a private dance with my wife." Florence laughed, a free, joyous sound that seemed to bubble up from some long-sealed well within her. "I believe you are." Hand in hand, they made their way from the barn, unnoticed in the general merriment. In the garden where they had shared their first dance months before, Virgil took Florence in his arms beneath a sky awash with stars. "Welcome home, Florence," he whispered against her hair. "Welcome to the beginning of our story." 6 months into their marriage, Florence had settled into a rhythm of life at the ranch that brought her more contentment than she'd ever known. Virgil had been true to his word, encouraging her interest in medicine by having a small room in the house converted into what he called her surgery, a place where she could treat minor injuries and illnesses among the ranch hands and neighboring families. Word of her skill spread quickly. Doc Patterson, rather than feeling territorial, seemed relieved to have someone to share his workload and began sending patients to her when his schedule was full. Florence found herself busy most days, applying poultices to burns, stitching wounds, and dispensing remedies for everything from toothaches to colic. "You found your calling," Virgil observed one evening as they sat on the porch after dinner, watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. "I've never seen you so fulfilled." Florence smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "I have you to thank for that." Most husbands would never allow their wives such freedom. Virgil's arm tightened around her. I didn't allow anything. This is who you are, who you've always been. I just had the good sense to recognize it. Their physical relationship had blossomed slowly, Virgil never pushing beyond what Florence was comfortable with. His patience and tenderness had gradually helped her overcome the clinical, dutiful approach to intimacy that her first marriage had instilled. With Virgil, she discovered that passion could be a joy rather than an obligation, that her body was capable of pleasure she'd never imagined. The only shadow on their happiness was Florence's monthly reminder that children were unlikely to bless their union. Each time her courses came, she felt a pang of regret not for herself, but for what she couldn't give Virgil. "Stop," he would say gently when he noticed her melancholy. "We agreed, remember, whatever happens, we face it together." In the spring of 1877, nearly a year after their first meeting, a letter arrived from Virgil's sister in Oregon. Catherine wrote that her husband had been offered a position in San Francisco, and they were considering the move. Would Virgil and Florence have room for visitors if they came to California to explore the opportunity? "Of course they must stay with us," Florence said immediately. "I've been longing to meet your family." The prospect of hosting Catherine, her husband, and their 3 boys prompted a flurry of activity at the ranch. Florence supervised a thorough cleaning of the house and planned menus that would appeal to growing boys. Virgil, seeing her enthusiasm, smiled indulgently. "They're going to love you," he assured her, "just as I do." The Harrises arrived on a warm May afternoon, their wagon kicking up dust as it approached the ranch house. Florence stood on the porch, smoothing her dress nervously while Virgil went to greet them. Catherine Zane Harris proved to be exactly as Florence had imagined her from the photograph, a tall, striking woman with her brother's blue eyes and direct gaze. She embraced Florence warmly, as if they were already sisters. "At last," she exclaimed, holding Florence at arm's length to look at her properly. "I was beginning to think Virgil was keeping you all to himself." Her husband, Robert, was a distinguished-looking man with kind eyes and a firm handshake. The boys Michael, now 13, James, 11, and Thomas, 8, hung back initially, eyeing their new aunt with cautious curiosity. It took less than a day for Florence to win them over. Michael, the oldest, was fascinated by her medical knowledge and peppered her with questions about treating various ailments. James was more interested in the horses, while young Thomas attached himself to Florence with the uncomplicated devotion of a child who recognizes a kindred spirit. "Aunt Florence," he asked on their 3rd day, following her as she gathered eggs from the henhouse, "do you and Uncle Virgil have any children?" The innocent question caught Florence off guard. "No," she said carefully, "we don't." "Why not? Don't you like children?" Florence set down her basket of eggs and knelt to Thomas's level. "I love children very much. Sometimes, though, even when people want children, they can't have them." Thomas considered this solemnly. "That's sad." "It can be," Florence agreed. "But your uncle and I are very happy together, even without children of our own." The boy nodded, apparently satisfied with this explanation. Then, with the directness only a child could manage, he asked, "Could I be your little boy sometimes? When I visit?" Tears sprang to Florence's eyes. "I would like that very much, Thomas." That evening, after the boys were in bed, the adults sat in the parlor with glasses of Virgil's good brandy. The conversation turned to the potential move to San Francisco, where Robert had been offered a position teaching mathematics at a prestigious school. "It would be a good opportunity," Robert explained. "Better education for the boys, more security for our future, but it's a big change from Oregon." "That's partly why we wanted to visit," Catherine added, "to see if California felt right for our family." Virgil glanced at Florence, a question in his eyes. She nodded slightly, understanding his unspoken thought. "We've been thinking," Virgil said, setting down his glass. "This ranch is more than Florence and I need, really. We've talked about building a second house on the property near the eastern ridge. It has the best view of the valley." Catherine raised an eyebrow. "Are you suggesting what I think you're suggesting?" "Why not?" Virgil smiled. "You and Robert could have your own home here. The boys would have space to grow, fresh air, horses. Robert could still teach. Panamint school needs a proper educator, and we'd be together, as family should be." Robert looked startled by the suggestion. "That's incredibly generous, Virgil." "But we couldn't impose. It's not an imposition," Florence interjected. "It's what we want. The boys bring such life to this place." She hesitated, then added softly, "And perhaps in some small way it would be like having children of our own." Catherine reached across the space between them to take Florence's hand. "You would be wonderful parents," she said with genuine warmth. "The boys already adore you." "Will you at least consider it?" Virgil asked. "Take your time. See how you feel about Panamint, about California. The offer stands, whenever you're ready." The 2 weeks of the Harrises' visit passed too quickly for Florence's liking. The house, which had never seemed empty when it was just her and Virgil, now felt cavernous without the boys' laughter and constant movement. She found herself lingering in the room where Thomas had slept, straightening already neat bedding, reluctant to erase the last traces of his presence. "You miss them," Virgil observed, finding her there 3 days after their departure. Florence nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. "They'll be back," he promised, drawing her into his arms. "Robert seemed genuinely interested in the school position, and Catherine wants to be near you. She told me so herself." "Near me?" Florence pulled back slightly to look at him. "Why?" Virgil smiled. "Because you're the sister she always wanted, and because she sees what I see, that you have so much love to give." Summer turned to fall and fall to winter. Christmas brought a letter from Catherine announcing that Robert had accepted a position as headmaster of the Panamint school to begin the following summer. They would take Virgil and Florence up on their offer to build on the ranch property if it still stood. Of course, it still stands. Virgil exclaimed after reading the letter aloud at breakfast. "We'll start planning the house right away. It should be ready by the time they arrive." Florence found herself caught up in his enthusiasm, sketching floor plans and making lists of furnishings they would need. The prospect of having the boys nearby, of watching them grow, filled a space in her heart that had ached for so long. In February, just as they were preparing to break ground on the new house, Florence fell ill. At first, she dismissed it as a winter chill, but when the nausea and fatigue persisted for more than a week, Virgil insisted she see Doc Patterson. "It's probably nothing," she protested weakly. "Humor me," Virgil replied, helping her into their buggy. "If our positions were reversed, you'd have dragged me to the doctor days ago." At the doctor's small office in town, Florence described her symptoms with clinical detachment, as if discussing a patient rather than herself. Doc Patterson listened, his expression unreadable, before asking Virgil to wait outside while he examined her. When the examination was complete, the doctor sat heavily in his chair, regarding Florence with a mixture of surprise and concern. "When was your last monthly cycle, Mrs. Zane?" Florence thought back, counting weeks in her head. "December, I suppose. With everything happening at the ranch, I hadn't noticed it was late." A cold fear gripped her. "Is something wrong? An illness?" Doc Patterson shook his head slowly. "Not an illness, no, Florence, you're with child. About 10 weeks along by my estimation." The world seemed to tilt beneath her. "That's not possible," she whispered. "The doctor in Bishop said." "Doctors can be wrong," Patterson interrupted gently. "It's rare. given your history, but not impossible. The human body is a mysterious thing. Florence placed a protective hand over her still flat stomach. The baby, will it? She couldn't bring herself to finish the question. I won't lie to you, the doctor said gravely. Your previous losses make this a high-risk pregnancy. You'll need to be extremely careful, no lifting, no strenuous work, plenty of rest. But there's always hope, Florence. Always. When she emerged from the doctor's office, Virgil took one look at her face and was at her side in an instant. What is it? What did he say? Florence glanced around the busy street. Not here. Let's go home. The ride back to the ranch was silent, Virgil respecting her need to process whatever news she'd received. Only when they were inside, seated before the fire in their bedroom, did she find the courage to speak. I'm pregnant, she said simply, watching his face carefully for his reaction. Virgil went utterly still, his expression frozen somewhere between shock and wonder. Pregnant, he repeated as if testing the word. But I thought. So did I. Doc Patterson says it's rare but not impossible. Florence's hands twisted in her lap. Virgil, I'm terrified after what happened before. He moved to kneel before her, taking her trembling hands in his. What did the doctor say about your chances this time? That I need to be careful, rest, no lifting or strenuous work. She took a shaky breath. But he didn't promise anything. How could he? Virgil's gaze was steady, his voice calm. Then we'll be careful. I'll hire more help for the ranch, someone to take over your duties in the surgery. Whatever we need to do, Florence, we'll do it. Together. You want this baby, she said, a statement rather than a question. I want you, he corrected gently. Safe and well. If this child is meant to be part of our family, I'll welcome it with all my heart. If not, he squeezed her hands. We already have a family, you and me, Catherine and Robert, the boys. Nothing will change that. The next months passed in a haze of cautious hope and constant vigilance. True to his word, Virgil hired a woman from town to help with the housework, and a young man interested in medicine to assist in Florence's surgery under her supervision. He rearranged the furniture in their bedroom to minimize her need to move about and took to bringing her breakfast in bed each morning. You're spoiling me, Florence protested one morning in May, as Virgil set a tray before her laden with fresh bread, fruit, and tea. I'm taking care of my wife, he corrected with a smile. There's a difference. As her body changed, growing round with new life, Florence alternated between joy and terror. Each week that passed without complication was a victory, but the memory of her previous losses haunted her dreams. Virgil held her through the nightmares, his steady presence an anchor in the storm of her fears. By June, Florence's pregnancy was obvious to anyone who saw her. The town's reaction was mixed. Some, like Doc Patterson, expressed genuine pleasure at the news, while others whispered behind their hands, speculating on whether the Zane baby would survive where the Bell babies had not. Ignore them, Virgil advised when Florence returned from a rare trip to town in tears after overhearing such comments. Their opinions don't matter. But what if they're right? Florence whispered. What if I lose this baby too? Virgil cupped her face in his hands. Then we will grieve together, and we will continue to live and love each other. But Florence, I believe in this child. I believe in you. His faith sustained her through the difficult summer months, as the heat made her uncomfortable, and the baby's movements grew stronger, a constant reminder of the precious life she carried. When she reached the 7th month, further than she'd gone with any previous pregnancy, Doc Patterson began visiting the ranch weekly to check on her progress. Everything looks good, he assured her after one such visit. The baby's position is ideal. Your blood pressure is normal. Just keep doing what you're doing. In late July, Catherine and her family arrived in Panamint. Though the new house wasn't yet complete, there was room enough in the main house for them to stay comfortably until construction finished. The boys were thrilled by Florence's condition, especially Thomas, who appointed himself her special helper. "Is it a boy or a girl?" he asked, placing his small hand on her rounded belly with reverent care. "We won't know until the baby arrives," Florence explained, smiling at his curiosity. "I hope it's a boy," Thomas declared. "Then I can teach him how to catch frogs." Florence laughed, ruffling his hair. "What if it's a girl?" Thomas considered this seriously. "Girls can catch frogs too, I guess, but not as good as boys." August brought the most difficult test yet. As Florence entered her 8th month, she woke one night to a sharp pain that made her gasp. Virgil, a light sleeper, was instantly alert. "What is it?" he asked, his voice tight with concern. "I don't know," Florence admitted, pressing a hand to her side. "A pain like a cramp, but stronger." Virgil was already pulling on his clothes. "I'm getting Doc Patterson." "Wait," Florence called as another pain gripped her. "It's too early, Virgil. The baby isn't due for weeks yet." His expression was grim in the dim light. "All the more reason to get the doctor." He returned an hour later with not only Doc Patterson, but also Catherine, who had been staying in town while the finishing touches were put on their new house. The doctor examined Florence carefully while Catherine prepared hot water and clean linens. "It's not labor," Patterson announced finally, to Florence's immense relief. "False contractions, Braxton Hicks, they're called, common in the later stages of pregnancy. But given your history, I want you on complete bed rest until the baby comes. No exceptions." The next weeks were the longest of Florence's life. Confined to bed, she could do nothing but wait and hope. Catherine proved a godsend, taking over the household duties and providing companionship during the long days. The boys visited often, bringing wildflowers for her bedside table and telling her stories of their adventures exploring the ranch. Virgil rarely left her side, conducting ranch business from a desk he had moved into their bedroom. At night, he would lie beside her, his hand resting protectively over their child, whispering plans for the future. "We'll teach him or her to ride as soon as they're old enough," he would say, "and to read, to appreciate poetry and history. We'll travel to San Francisco, maybe even back east someday to see the ocean." "You've thought about all this," Florence observed, touched by his detailed dreams. "Every day since you told me," he admitted. "I can't help it. But Florence, remember our promise. Whatever happens, we face it together," she finished, squeezing his hand. "I remember." September brought cooler temperatures and finally the first pangs of true labor. Florence recognized the difference immediately. These contractions had a purpose, a rhythm that her body instinctively understood. "It's time," she told Virgil calmly when he returned from checking on the cattle. "Send for Doc Patterson and Catherine." The labor was long but uncomplicated. With Catherine on one side and Virgil refusing to leave the other, Florence worked through each contraction with determination. Doc Patterson monitored her progress, his experienced hands checking the baby's position regularly. "You're doing beautifully," he encouraged her as the hours passed. "Everything is progressing exactly as it should." As dawn broke over the Panamint Valley, Florence gave one final, mighty push, and her child slipped into the world with a lusty cry that broke the silence of the morning. Doc Patterson caught the baby expertly, clearing its mouth and nose before pronouncing, "A boy. A fine, healthy boy." He placed the squalling infant on Florence's chest, where he immediately began to root against her skin. The sensation of her son's warmth, his tiny perfect fingers and wrinkled red face, overwhelmed Florence with a love so powerful it took her breath away. "He's beautiful," Virgil whispered, his voice choked with emotion as he gazed down at their child. Perfect. He pressed his lips to Florence's forehead, tears streaming unashamedly down his face. Thank you. For him, for everything. They named him Samuel Joseph Zane, in memory of the baby Florence had lost and in honor of her father, who had come to accept and even appreciate Virgil over the past year. When Joseph and Martha Rutledge visited to meet their grandson, Florence watched with quiet amazement as her stern father melted at the sight of the infant. "He has your eyes," Joseph said gruffly, one finger caught in Samuel's tiny but surprisingly strong grip. "Same color as when you were born." Martha, holding the baby with practiced ease, murmured soft nonsense words to him, a tender expression on her face that Florence hadn't seen in years. "He's strong," she observed. "A fighter like his mother." Florence exchanged a startled look with Virgil at what might have been the first genuine compliment her mother had paid her in adulthood. "Yes," Virgil agreed, his arm around Florence's shoulders, "just like his mother." As autumn painted the hills in gold and crimson once more, the Zane ranch buzzed with activity and life. The Harris family had settled into their new home on the eastern ridge, close enough for daily visits, but far enough to give both families their privacy. The three Harris boys doted on baby Samuel, taking turns holding him under Florence's watchful eye. Thomas, in particular, had appointed himself the baby's special protector. "When he's bigger," he informed Florence seriously, "I'll teach him everything I know." "I'm counting on it," she replied, smiling at the boy who had claimed a piece of her heart. One crisp October evening, as Samuel slept peacefully in his cradle, Florence and Virgil sat on their porch watching the sunset. Her body was still recovering from childbirth, but she felt stronger each day, grateful for the miracle of their son's safe arrival. "You remember the first time we met?" Virgil asked, his arm around her as they shared a blanket against the evening chill. Florence smiled at the memory. "You came looking for someone to help your injured ranch hand. I never imagined where that day would lead us." "I knew," Virgil said simply. "Not everything, of course, but I knew you were special, that my life would never be the same after meeting you, even knowing about my past. The babies I'd lost," Virgil turned to face her fully. "Especially knowing that. Your strength in the face of such loss, your compassion despite your own pain, those are the things I fell in love with, Florence. Your body was never your worth to me. It was always your heart, your mind, your soul." Florence leaned into him, content in a way she had never believed possible. "I used to think God was punishing me," she admitted, "that I had failed as a woman, as a wife. And now," Virgil prompted gently. She thought of Samuel, of the family they had built, not just their son, but Catherine and Robert, the boys, even her parents with their grudging acceptance that had grown into something like respect. "Now I think perhaps he was leading me to where I was meant to be all along," she said. "To you, to this life we've created together." As the last rays of sunlight gilded the mountains in the distance, Virgil kissed her with the same tenderness he had shown that first time in his stable, a lifetime ago. "Welcome home, Florence," he whispered against her lips. "Welcome to the rest of our story." And as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky above Panamint Valley, Florence Zane held her husband close, grateful for the unexpected path that had led her to this moment, to this man who had seen her true worth when she herself had forgotten it. Together, they would write the rest of their story, one day at a time, in love and understanding, as equal partners in the life they had chosen to share.